Today's video is sponsored by World of Warships, the ultimate naval warfare experience, and I'll tell you more about them in just a bit. This year, 2023, marked 20 years since the US-led invasion of Iraq. An invasion that resulted in a swift military victory over Saddam's forces, followed by state collapse, civil war, and endless chaos. Now, looking back on the anniversary of this most inglorious of wars, many commenters painted a picture of good intentions gone catastrophically wrong. Of an intervention that damaged American credibility, killed hundreds of thousands, and poisoned domestic politics. A stark warning on the dangers of military adventures. Yet Iraq isn't the only foreign policy disaster to mark a significant anniversary this year. A decade ago, the US stood on the brink of another intervention in the Middle East, only to pull back at the last second. The result? Chaos and carnage equal to anything in Iraq. The year was 2013. That August, regime forces loyal to Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad massacred 1,500 civilians with nerve gas, crossing a clear American red line. But rather than airstrikes and sanctions, the White House responded with nothing. Assad would continue gassing his own people and committing atrocities with complete impunity. Was this the anti-Iraq, a time when intervention would have been the right call, or would going in gung-ho have caused an even greater disaster? Well, today we're going to dive into what happened that tense summer a decade ago and try and figure out if intervention would have made things better or made them even worse. So get ready to drop anchor with me, because today's video is sponsored by World of Warships. World of Warships is a totally free-to-play game available on PC, and it is pretty epic. The best part about the game, every month new content drops bringing fresh ships, new in-game nations, and even more ship classes. World of Warships 12 vs 12 arenas also guarantee that you'll have a blast with each new update. Plus, amazing graphics and sound provide a truly immersive experience. World of Warships boasts over 40 unique maps with dynamic weather, and all of them have been updated with jaw-dropping new water effects and textures that will make you feel like you're actually sailing the high seas. Take your pick from multiple ship classes, or whether you're a big fan of big-hitting battleships, quick and deadly destroyers, doodle cruisers, sneaky submarines, or maybe you're ready to take to the sky with aircraft carriers. Plus, if you're a console gamer, don't worry, the game's available on consoles too. In World of Warships, you'll be able to command a huge naval fleet featuring some of the most iconic war vessels from history. Plus, each ship is hyper-accurate to its real-life counterpart, so you'll feel like you're in the thick of the action. World of Warships also has a massive active community that brings together players from all walks of life. Join clans to compete in competitive game modes and chat with other war gamers on their official Discord or discuss the game on their forum. So what are you waiting for, mateys? Hoist the sails and check out this amazing game. And if you do that, I promise I won't do any more pirate impressions. Click on the link in the description below, use the code WARSHIPS during registration to score exclusive rewards, including doubloons, credits, a premium account time, and even a ship. And now back to today's video. The rockets that fell on Ghouta that night were unlike anything that had fallen before. A rebel-held suburb in Greater Damascus, Ghouta had been placed under a state of siege by Syrian regime forces. Forces that over 2 years into the civil war were already well-versed in atrocities. But the massacre that unfolded early in the morning of August the 21st, 2013 would be on another level. Not long after the rockets landed, civilians far from the impact site reported feeling their eyes sting. It was, one survivor later told Western newspapers, like being inside a kitchen when someone is frying chilies. Closer to where the rockets fell, though, the symptoms were far less benign. In those unfortunate streets, people convulsed on the ground, foam seeping from their mouths. Women, children, and men all died in agony, suffocating as their bodies were racked by spasms. The culprit? Sarin, a lethal nerve agent first developed by the Nazis. By dropping it on Ghouta, the Assad regime had just carried out the deadliest chemical attack in decades. By US estimates, 1,429 civilians died that night, a number that included 426 children. Most importantly, from the Pentagon's perspective, though, the attack also crossed an American red line, one that had been laid down by President Obama almost exactly a year earlier. A crossing that seemed all but guaranteed to ensure that the US would enter the Syrian civil war. Back in December of 2010, a Tunisian fruit vendor had self-immolated during a protest, a dramatic act that kicked off the Arab Spring. Across multiple states in North Africa and the Middle East, long-serving tyrants were toppled, most famously Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. When the protests hit Syria, though, things had taken a far more brutal course. From the moment people took to the streets in the southwestern city of Daraa, Bashar al-Assad's security forces had responded with overwhelming might. Crowds were fired upon, protesters summarily executed, survivors dragged away and tortured. By August 2011, reports of regime-directed murder and mutilation had grown just so frequent that President Obama called for Assad to step aside. But with the US then busy intervening in Libya, the White House didn't take any concrete steps to ensure Assad stood down, although the tyrant's increasing brutality would soon trigger a more direct warning. On the 20th of August 2012, President Obama informed reporters that America had red lines in Syria, the biggest of which was the use of chemical weapons. Or, as the president put it,
a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized.
Although Obama didn't spell it out, the underlying assumption was that a chemical attack would invite an immediate military response. Not that Assad seemed to get the message. Just 4 months later, in December of 2012, the Syrian regime used poison gas for the first time, dispersing Agent 15 over a neighborhood in Homs City, killing 7. When that invited no retaliation, Assad's forces grew bolder. March the 19th, 2013, as the distinction of being the day of the first recorded sarin attack of the Syrian civil war, when the nerve agent was released in the Khan al-Assad neighborhood of Aleppo. In that case, both the government and opposition groups blamed each other. But there were no such ambiguities over what happened next. That month and the next, Syria suffered multiple chemical attacks. By June, the French government was declaring it had evidence of multiple sarin attacks carried out by government forces. The allegations were strong enough that the UN authorized a team headed by Professor Erik Sahlstrom to investigate. Yet the US government still didn't deem Obama's red line to have been crossed. Then came the Ghouta attack, and all remaining ambiguity that evaporated. By September the 15th, the Sahlstrom team would have solid proof that sarin had been used in the massacre, but even beforehand, the pressure was building for America to respond. In Europe, both France and the UK indicated they would join any military intervention. On Syria's border, Turkey was demanding an aerial campaign that would cripple the Assad regime. Yet Obama would never order the expected strikes. How he came to this decision is a tale that still haunts US foreign policy to this very day. If you read some of the accounts from those who were there at the time, the debate over whether to strike Syria was a moral minefield. On the one hand, there was the need to uphold international norms against the use of chemical weapons, and the fear that failing to act could both encourage other rogue states and make the US look weak. On the other, there were fears that strikes against regime targets could topple Assad so quickly that the Syrian government would lose control of its WMDs. The Pentagon believed airstrikes could only destroy about 30% of Assad's stockpiles, leaving the rest open to potential seizure by jihadi forces. On top of that, there were practical reasons the administration didn't want to go in. Secret nuclear talks with Syria back at Iran were underway, and the White House feared airstrikes might cause the Iranians to pull out. Really though, most of this was mere window dressing. Because the real discussion wasn't about credibility and nuclear talk, but the ghosts haunting the government. The ghosts of 2 other interventions in the Middle East that had failed spectacularly. Ghosts known as Iraq and Libya. Just 2 years prior, in 2011, Washington and its allies had set out to stop Gaddafi massacring anti-regime demonstrators by imposing a no-fly zone over Libya. Quickly, though, the goal of the mission had broadened. Government forces had been bombed, Gaddafi overthrown and killed, and the rebels handed victory. Only what followed hadn't been the triumph of liberal democracy in Tripoli. No, it had been state implosion, a collapse into chaos that sent Libya spiraling into a hell from which it still hasn't returned. Iraq loomed even larger. After invading in 2003, the US-led coalition had overseen a total breakdown of law and order that led to thousands of American and tens of thousands of Iraqi deaths and continued to suck in billions of dollars annually. Speaking on Pod Save the World for the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, former Obama foreign policy advisor Ben Rhodes was blunt about the impact it had on the Syria decision, saying, "You felt the ghost of Iraq that whole week." Nor was it just those in power who could feel the specter looming over them. In the aftermath of the Ghouta attack, polls by Reuters and other news organizations showed as few as 9% of Americans were in favor of strikes on Syria. Over 60% were against them. It was similar in Britain. Although the government of David Cameron had promised to back any strikes, public anger over the debacles in Iraq and Libya forced him to put intervention to Parliament. In a shock outcome, the government lost by 13 votes. Even as Obama was still considering his options, one of America's closest allies had ruled itself out. Congress likewise seemed unwilling to enforce the red line. Even though Democrats held the Senate, it seemed unlikely Obama could win any vote on the issue. Not that he needed to, though. In contrast to David Cameron, Obama would have been within his legal right as president to order retaliation over Assad's massacre, which is what makes what happened next quite so strange. On August the 31st, the press gathered for what was billed as a major speech, one in which everyone assumed that the president would declare an intervention in Syria. Instead, Barack Obama told astonished reporters that he would seek authorization from Congress to bomb Assad's forces. Even now, a decade later, people still argue about Obama's thinking, whether he was doing the right thing or whether he was just trying to spread blame when Congress inevitably voted the motion down. Now, obviously, we've got no idea what the truth is, but it's essentially a moot point. The vote in Congress never happened. Instead, the crisis was diffused by an offer from an unlikely source, a source these days more associated with its own horrific atrocities against civilians, a source that, as you watch this, is waging its own genocidal war in Ukraine. We're talking, of course, about Russia. At the time, it looked like a masterpiece of diplomacy, a joining together of two adversaries to disarm a rogue madman. As the debate over Syria reached boiling point, a reporter asked John Kerry, then Secretary of State, what Assad could do to stop the Americans from bombing. Kerry responded with a bit of grim irony, saying Assad could voluntarily surrender his entire stock of chemical weapons. It was meant as a flippant comment to reinforce the fact that any intervention that followed would be the fault of the guy with the WMDs. But within 90 minutes, Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, was on the phone telling Kerry the Syrians were interested in his proposal. This was important because along with Iran, Russia was one of Assad's key backers. If any capital could influence the monster in Damascus, it was Moscow. What followed was a whirlwind of diplomacy. On September the 9th, Obama called off the congressional votes while the US and Russia talked. By the 14th, they had a working deal. In return for surrendering all chemical weapons, Syria would be spared American retaliation. To ensure compliance, the US and Russia jointly agreed to impose sanctions and authorize military force if the regime conducted another attack like Ghouta. Obama administration officials would later describe this deal as a spectacular win, a success story of dialogue triumphing over brute force. After some 1,200 metric tons of sarin, VX, and sulfur mustard were removed from Syria and destroyed, the president memorably boasted, "It turns out we're getting chemical weapons out of Syria without having initiated a strike." Sadly, though, the White House had actually achieved no such thing. Just 6 months after their deal was inked, on April the 11th, 2014, a regime helicopter dropped a barrel containing poison gas on the opposition-held village of Kafajita. It was the beginning of a wave of similar attacks. In each case, reports came in of clouds of colored gas and people choking in the streets. The cause would turn out to be chlorine, an industrial product that had been exempted from the deal for economic reasons, but which was now being used to murder anti-Assad activists. At first, Russia seemed to cooperate with the US. Lavrov supported the creation of the Joint Investigative Mechanism, or JIM, to go to Syria and examine evidence. They finally began work in 2015, culminating in a report the following year. But then, the war in Syria had taken yet another turn. ISIS were running wild and staging their own gas attacks, one of which the JIM report covered. But the findings on the two other attacks couldn't have been clearer. On the 21st of April 2014 and on the 16th of March 2016, the Syrian government had used chlorine gas on its own people. By rights, this should have triggered a Security Council response. When Lavrov first suggested his deal back in 2013, a key provision had been the joint American-Russian resolution to authorize action against Assad. It quickly became clear, though, that the Russians had only ever intended to stall for time. Rather than accept the JIM report, the Kremlin attacked the investigation as politically biased. The Security Council became paralyzed, unable to do anything under the threat of Russia's veto. Things finally came to a head on April the 4th, 2017. On that day, the Syrian government dropped sarin on the town of Khan Shaykhun. About 100 people died just as all those civilians had in Ghouta, their limbs twitching, suffocating, foaming at the mouths. Rather than destroy all of his stockpiles, Assad had kept a few in reserve. And now it was clear the UN and the US were unwilling to do anything. The dictator had no compunction about using them. So, that's the sad history of the failed 2013 intervention, a moment when America tried desperately to learn from its mistakes in Libya and Iraq, only to make different mistakes in the process. Now, with that background done, we can turn to the interlinked questions that we wanted to pose with this video. Would things have turned out better had Obama given the order to strike in the summer of 2013? And if not, could they have instead turned out worse? Perhaps the best place to start is by looking at how non-intervention ultimately helped two of America's greatest foes, Russia and Iran. Speaking of Russia in 2023, the image that comes to mind is of a state mixing genocidal impulses with staggering incompetence. Incompetence on the scale of accidentally bombing their own cities, as happened in Belgorod this April. So it can be a surprise to remember that prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the world saw Vladimir Putin not as a paranoid, incontinent failure, but as an evil chess master, one playing a 3D game most mortals couldn't hope to comprehend. To remind yourself why, I'll look no further than Syria. Talking Obama out of intervention after Ghouta wasn't just a masterful way to make America look weak and indecisive, nor was it just a way to ensure Assad remained in power. It was a means to project Russian power not just in the Middle East, but globally, to show the world that as the US retreated from its role of world policeman, Russia was more than happy to step up. You could see this clearest in the air campaign. In 2015, after years of blocking US action on Syria, the Kremlin suddenly announced its own airstrike campaign. Publicly, the reason was to accelerate the defeat of ISIS, which was by then waging attacks in Europe. In reality, though, only a fraction of Russian missiles struck jihadi targets. The rest were spent eliminating pro-Western rebels and massacring civilians. The Russian tactics were simple. Identify an area where anti-Assad fighters were embedded in the local community and then carpet bomb them until said community no longer existed. They did this by targeting schools, hospitals, markets, anywhere ordinary people who might be against Assad gathered. By the end of 2022, it's estimated Russian bombs had killed 24,743 civilians. In doing so, they broke the will of the rebels to fight. With Russian air support, the regime went from teetering on the brink to firmly back in control of much of the country. But perhaps the biggest impact was psychological. Most of Russia's modern generals cut their teeth in the Syrian air campaign. It's where the strategy was developed that would soon see in Mariupol and the airstrikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. A strategy of reducing the population to animal conditions to break an opponent's morale. Some, such as the Times of London, have even argued that you can draw a straight line between Putin's bloody successes in Syria and his decision to attack Ukraine in 2022. Now, that is a pretty controversial assessment. At the same time, it's not totally implausible that victory in Syria gave Putin the confidence boost to make his reckless gamble. Just as it's not totally implausible that American inaction convinced him Washington wouldn't come to Kiev's aid. But we don't want to make this video all about Russia, because there was another anti-Western nation that had its fortunes massively boosted by Assad's victory in Syria, and that's Iran. Initially, Iran's interventions on the side of Assad looked like they would be a disaster. Desperate to keep another Shia government in power amid a region increasingly ruled by Sunni leaders, Iran spent billions propping up the butcher of Syria. At the height of the fighting, the Revolutionary Guard were losing thousands of elite soldiers on the battlefield. Once the Russian air campaign got underway, though, Tehran's fortunes started to shift. By the time the war wound down into its current stalemate, it was clear Iran's gamble had paid off. Even more than Russia, Iran is now the premier foreign power in Syria. That's allowed Tehran to create a direct link between the homeland and the parts of Lebanon under the control of its Hezbollah allies, giving the Iranian regime greater influence than it's enjoyed in years. The impact of this destabilized the Middle East even further. It seems likely that successes in Syria encouraged Iran to forcefully pursue its proxy war with Saudi Arabia in Yemen, a proxy war that in its own way became as deadly and as destructive as the conflict in Syria. At this stage, though, we're still dealing with real life, with events that actually happened and are therefore relatively straightforward to evaluate. It's time now, though, for us to take a different path, to plunge into the world of hypotheticals and attempt to untangle the thorniest question of all. What might have happened if the US had intervened after Ghouta? To stop this part getting too complicated, we're gonna refrain from laying out all of the potential outcomes, good and bad, next to one another. Instead, we're gonna focus on the potential upside of Obama enforcing his red line, while the next one is going to detail the ways intervention may have made things even worse. To get ourselves in the pro-intervention mindset, let's kick off with a quote from a recent report by Germany's center-right Konrad Adenauer Foundation think tank, or KAS for short. Even inaction can have dramatic consequences. Restraint in Syria ultimately contributed to the humanitarian crisis we see today. Because interventions like Iraq and Libya were so catastrophic, we're used to seeing all interference as morally murky. What the KAS report reminds us, though, is that doing nothing can be equally unethical, especially when even limited action could have profoundly positive outcomes. That's the conclusion many in the French establishment have come to. As former ambassador Michel Duclos recently told The Guardian in 2013, the Syrian revolution was salvageable. As early as December 2012, Assad's regime was teetering on the brink. Both Iran and Russia had privately told the dictator he wouldn't be able to hold on. Had the US, with or without France and the UK, responded to the Ghouta attack by bombing regime targets, it's likely the Syrian government would have collapsed. And while that would have brought risks, the nation in 2013 still had yet to utterly implode. As Duclos put it, at the time, the moderate opposition was still powerful. The jihadists on the sidelines, Iran awaiting the nuclear agreement, and Vladimir Putin hesitant. In this scenario, a regime collapse could have been followed by the pro-democracy forces declaring victory. ISIS was not yet on the scene. Although war-torn, Syria, perhaps, could have been salvaged. Then, of course, there's the intangible benefits of enforcing a red line. Throughout the 2013 debates over intervention, Deputy National Security Advisor Antony Blinken had kept reminding the president that superpowers don't bluff. His point was that a nation as powerful and as respected as America can't make a red line and then ignore someone crossing it, not unless it wants to see its credibility vanish. Had Obama authorized strikes, they would have been a strong signal to Russia, Iran, and China that America does not f*** around. A signal Vladimir Putin may have considered before annexing Crimea the following year. Incredibly, all of this might have been achieved without putting that many boots on the ground. As the KAS report points out, intervention needn't have come in the form of a full-on American assault or an attempt at regime change. Instead, the administration could have simply imposed a no-fly zone over parts of Syrian airspace. This could have then been used to create safe zones for civilians where the regime couldn't get them. It could also have halted not just chemical weapons attacks, but the carpet bombing that came later in the war, which would reduce entire cities to rubble. At the bare minimum, such an approach would have likely saved tens of thousands of lives. It could also have left some of Syria's cities and infrastructure standing, avoiding the total economic collapse we saw in our timeline. And it's worth remembering just how bad things got in real life. Today, the UN estimates that between 306,000 and 350,000 have been killed in the Syrian conflict. Half the population became refugees that transformed the politics of the countries they sought shelter in, from tiny cash-strapped Lebanon to proud and wealthy Germany. Of those who remained, more than 90% now live in crushing poverty. Syria still lies in ruins. Assad is still in power. And most damningly, the regime is estimated to have carried out over 350 chemical weapon attacks across the conflict. With statistics like these, it's hard to argue in hindsight against a forceful 2013 intervention. After all, it's not like things could have possibly been worse. At least, that's the assumption, but not everybody agrees. A large proportion of knowledgeable people remain convinced that America going in gung-ho to Syria in 2013 wouldn't have caused less carnage, but simply plunged everyone into a whole new level of hell. When people in 2023 argue non-intervention in Syria 10 years ago was the right call, they're usually coming from one of two perspectives: the general and the specifically American. That's because, as the nation that would have led any strikes after the Ghouta massacre, the US would have borne the brunt of any fallout from things going badly sideways. And from the point of view of Washington, things could have easily turned out much worse than they already did. One reason for this is the immortal principle known as "you break it, you buy it." Let's assume Obama had ordered strikes on the regime targets back in 2013. As we've already seen, there's a strong likelihood that these strikes could have led to the collapse of Assad's government, at which point the US would have been held responsible for everything that ensued. Now, that everything might have been a victory for the democratic forces and the establishment of a functional or semi-functional state that followed international norms, what we might call the Kosovo model for interventions. On the other hand, it might have been an Iraq or Libya-style quagmire, or a barely functional state like US-backed Afghanistan. With America already embroiled in two expensive wars, a Syrian catastrophe could have been the final nail in the coffin of outward-looking US foreign policy. Burns, not 3, but 4 separate times. It's possible today's Washington would be so isolationist that no American arms would currently be keeping Ukraine propped up in its fight against Russia. As is easier to imagine when you consider that even a no-fly zone might have translated into boots on the ground to secure WMDs. One old estimate put the total number of troops that would have been required at 40,000. Naturally, tragically, some of those young men and women would have returned in body bags. Speaking of WMDs, one potential bad outcome for the world in general would have been if some of them went missing following a regime collapse. Awful as he may be, Assad has at least kept his chemical weapons firmly within the borders of his own nation. Had they been stolen by jihadists, though, there's no need to think they wouldn't have travelled further afield. The doomsday scenario would have been a terror group using stolen sarin to mass murder civilians in Israel, Europe, even the United States. Dispersed in a crowded, enclosed space at the right time, it could have led to carnage on a scale not seen since 9/11. How such an attack, coming as a direct result of American intervention, might have impacted the world, hardly even bears thinking about. And so after all of that, we finally come to the end of today's video. As so often with our modern fare on this channel, we don't aim to end with a definitive conclusion. While we might have included a direct question in the title of this piece, it's not a question with a clear-cut answer, simply because life is not clear-cut. Could the US have done more in Syria? Well, yes, self-evidently. No matter your politics, the whole Obama red line thing was clearly a messaging debacle. On the other hand, we have no way of truly knowing if an intervention in 2013 would have made things better or worse. While it's tempting to say things couldn't possibly have turned out worse for the people of Syria, there's one thing doing these sorts of videos has taught us. In war, things can always get worse. Perhaps then it's best to end this video with an acknowledgement that there aren't always easy choices or easy solutions, that even with hindsight, it's not always possible to see what was the right call. All we can do now is try and remember those who really suffered in this horrific civil war, the people of Syria, the ordinary people whose lives were ultimately ruined and ended by this decade-long catastrophe, a catastrophe much of the world has sadly already moved on from. That's all for today's video. Please do check out our fantastic sponsor, World of Warships, and use the promo code WARSHIPS to grab your exclusive rewards. And I'll see you in the next video.